Anything? Is this microphone working, or is that just for the camera? Oh, okay. So everybody can hear me. All right. Well, thank you for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. Rather than stand here and read something to you, I just thought I would have a conversation, and we'll tell a few stories because there are a lot of stories attached with First Baptist Church. I don't know who came up with this title. Me. Legacy and Legends, an Anecdotal History of First Baptist Church. And that'll work. What I'm trying to do here, I was asked to, come up with important moments, personalities that were rather decisive for the history and the identity of our congregation. And there are a lot of them. There are a lot of stories that we could tell about overcoming the yellow fever, epidemics of the 1820s and the 3 hurricanes that struck Savannah in the 1890s, one of which took the roof off of the sanctuary across the street. We could talk about the end of the Civil War with General Sherman arriving. You've heard that story. And Sylvanus Landrum, the pastor, preached to a congregation of Confederate soldiers one Sunday and a congregation of Union soldiers the next, with Savannah having fallen during the week. So there are lots of stories like that. But what I'm isolating here this morning, and then we'll continue 2 weeks from today, are some moments, good and bad, that shaped us and formed us. The history of people and institutions is not usually all one-sided. We're kind of a mixture of things, and that is true about our church. Of course, we were founded in November of 1800. There were Baptists here before that, largely associated. Well, we think there were 3 or 4 Baptists on the ship with Oglethorpe in 1733, but they didn't form a church for almost 70 years. There were some early Baptists associated with George Whitfield's Bethesda home, the orphanage out south of here, and that is apparently where the first practice of baptism and the Lord's Supper took place in the area, was out at the orphanage at the Bethesda. There's a plaque out there on the marsh that you can see was placed by the Georgia Baptist Convention in the 1950s, I think. So there were Baptists here, but they didn't get around to forming a church, a congregation. They had a building, and at one point, they even allowed the Independent Presbyterian Church to use the building. Independent had a fire that took out one of their buildings. They also had a Baptist pastor who was a strong Calvinist, and we ended up stealing their pastor, Henry Holcomb, and he became the pastor of the First Baptist Church. So it's kind of a long and interesting story. Of course, slavery was present, not in the beginning of the colony. Lynn knows this because she's given more than one tour. There were, I think, 3 things at least that were outlawed in the early colony of Georgia. One was lawyers, one was Catholics, and one was slavery. And if you think about it, they gave up on all 3 of those prohibitions. And hard liquor, yeah. So slavery was a part of the fabric of this society from the very beginning. And this slide here, some of you have seen this, it's from Harper's Weekly, I think in 1861. This is called a chorograph. It attempts to translate statistical information into colors. So the darker the area, these are counties in Georgia, the darker the area, the larger the slave population. And I can't enlarge this, but if you were to get up here and look at Chatham, there's a 71 above the word Chatham. And going down the coast, Liberty County is 74, McIntosh 78, Glenn County 86% of population that was slave. So the people living in Savannah and who came to be a part of this church in 1800 would have been living in a culture that supported slavery. That was very much a part of what was happening here. And you look at other parts of the state, there's not nearly, like Carroll County, where Carrollton, Georgia is, 11%. Down around Albany was a very high concentration. Fulton, I looked at that. Of course, Fulton then had not merged with Milton County. You know, the present Fulton County is, here's Fulton. It's kind of illegible. It looks like Henry County was 33, and maybe the city of Atlanta was 30%. There's a 20 here. I'm guessing 20 to 30% in that area, right up there. So slavery was a part of this culture. Now, the cotton gin was, 1787, 89, something like that, right at the end of the 18th century. And as you know, that contributed to the profitability of cotton as a crop. And so whatever reservations they had in the colony about slavery kind of went by the wayside as slave labor became more and more important. Walk around downtown Savannah any day of the week, most of the hardscape, including that sanctuary building across the street, was probably built by slaves. We know our sanctuary was built by rented slaves, you know, from one of the nearby plantations. One of my projects in my retirement is to figure out who those people were. And I don't know we can ever surface a first name on them, but they came from a plantation. So slavery is a part of the culture. Now, this is a very interesting book that came out about 20, 25 years ago by my friend, now deceased, Bob Gardner. Taught for years and years and years at Shorter College in Rome, Georgia, and retired to Macon, where his daughter and son-in-law still live to this day. Frank Broom's father-in-law is Bob Gardner, was Bob Gardner. He was a Baptist historian, and he produced this book, A Decade of Debate and Division, Georgia Baptists and the Formation of the Southern Baptist Convention. This came out in 1995, so this is 30 years old. But I kidded him about this. This is a book that only a guy like Bob Gardner would produce. I was asked to write a book review of this for the Christian Index, the Baptist state newspaper of Georgia, and I said in there that Bob Gardner never met a roll of microfilm that he didn't like. And he took that as a compliment, which it sort of was. What he did here was to go through and determine who the delegates were in 1845 at the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention, and which ones of them were from the state of Georgia. It was a high percentage of the delegates because the meeting was in Augusta. 153 persons, all of them men, I'm pretty sure, attended this meeting in Augusta in 1845, and he's done all this research on these people, including information from census records about how many slaves they owned. He says in the book that in the 1860 census that I believe the average number of slaves owned by a person in Georgia was 11.2. 11 slaves per person on average. And I want to say that the slave population, or was that from that last slide? I've seen a 500,000 figure. I'm not sure if that was just Georgia or that was more than Georgia. But of the delegates to the Southern Baptist Convention formation in 1845 at First Baptist Augusta, they owned on average 22 slaves. So they owned twice the number of slaves as the average person in the state of Georgia, which you can read all kinds of things into that. A lot of them were ministers. A lot of them were lawyers. Some of them were professors at Mercer and other universities. Some of them were students, but on average, they owned 22 slaves.
Because that had to be for a male, one male.
Yes. Yes.
Per person, one male.
Yeah. I guess that's probably right. Yeah. So what I'm trying to describe here is, a culture that is very much in keeping with slavery. It's a part of the fabric of the society. It's the way of life. So some of you know that the three major Protestant denominations in the United States in the 1840s divided over this issue. Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists, all three divided over the issue of slavery. Sometimes, in retrospect, Baptist historians, and I'm talking about in the early first half of the 20th century, came up with other explanations for why the Southern Baptist Convention was formed. They said there was an issue of representation. We were sending all this money to the denomination, and we weren't getting anything back for it. We weren't getting missionaries in our part of the country. Other explanations, but the main reason for the division was the issue of slavery. In general terms, Baptists in the North, just as with Methodists and Presbyterians and others, had a tendency toward supporting abolition, and Baptists in the South were more defensive of the institution of slavery. So this brings us to this person, who was the second pastor of this church, William Boline Johnson. This is a picture of him, I think, later in life. He was the second pastor he has a little mileage on him, doesn't he? This is a name you need to know. When we were in seminary, as Norma and I were taught, this man was the father of the Southern Baptist Convention. And that's not too much of a stretch, because he wrote the Constitution, the first Constitution, and he also wrote a document called An Address to the Public, in which he described the creation of the Southern Baptist Convention, why it was necessary. He was the impetus. Now, he was here